Today, I'm going to defend the counterintuitive hypothesis that the best way to improve thoracic extension is actually by targeting rotational movement, so twisting movements. Last week in my video, I laid this out as one of the key concepts in solving the overhead mobility problem. So if you're somebody who wants an efficient overhead position for lifting barbells overhead, or you want to be able to achieve the correct alignment in a handstand, then stay tuned for some really powerful drills along with a deep dive into the anatomical explanation for why they work. Last week, I gave the surface level explanation that in order to get the rib cage moving, we needed to attack side flexion and rotational movements rather than focusing on flexion and extension directly. This week, we're going to look in detail at the anatomical structures of the spine and how their features facilitate and inhibit various types of movement. In a minute, I'll explain what these are and how they change the way I think about the spine. Once I've finished presenting evidence to back up my argument, I'll go through a series of movements and stretches that I developed based on this new understanding, which helped me finally open up my T-spine after years of doing things the wrong way. If you just want to see the stretches, by all means skip ahead, but for me, it's really important to understand the why, because I see this as how we gradually connect the dots and improve our problem-solving ability. I genuinely believe that by understanding the solution to this problem in detail, it's going to help me solve another problem down the road. Right, now let's get you oriented with some spinal anatomy from this side view. The top section, the neck, has 7 vertebrae, also called the cervical spine. The middle, purple section, shown here without the rib cage attached, is called the thoracic spine and consists of 12 vertebrae. And the bottom section, shown in yellow, are the 5 lumbar vertebrae. Now let's take a look from this posterior view. So I like to think about the head and the pelvis as just being one more vertebrae on top and bottom of the spine. I realize this is not how it's taught in anatomy textbooks, but I think it's helpful from a movement perspective to think about this way, just thinking about the head as one more vertebrae. So if you think about the way your head moves, it has a lot of movement in all 3 planes of motion. And then if you think about how much movement you have in your pelvis, if you stand up and try and side flex or, flex and extend your pelvis or rotate your pelvis, it really doesn't have very much movement at all in relation to the vertebrae above it. It's super stable. So your head, it has a lot of mobility and less stability, and your pelvis has a lot of stability and less mobility. So you can think about this as a bit of a rule of thumb. So more movement in the neck, in the cervical spine, and relatively less movement in the thoracic and lumbar spine. And in the same way, the lumbar spine is very stable and there's less stability as we go up into the thoracic and into the neck. If you stand up and dance around and just kind of move your head and your spine and your pelvis a little bit, I think you'll find that that rule holds pretty well. But let's think about why that is. So as we move down the spine, the vertebral bodies get gradually bigger. So that means the bigger the vertebral body, it means there's more surface area, more cartilage, more connective tissue connecting it to the vertebrae either side of it. And that's what gives us increased stability. You also have these facet joints. So this is what I promised I'd explain earlier. These little joints on the top and bottom of the back of each vertebrae are called facet joints. And they are oriented differently in different sections of the spine. So you can see in the cervical spine, they're faced mainly upwards. So the most mobile section of the spine, the facet joints are faced upwards. In the thoracic spine, you can see here they're kind of facing towards you, so they're oriented backwards. And then in the lumbar spine, they're facing mainly inwards. And the orientation of these facet joints kind of constrain and inhibit movement in various ways. So obviously the top section where the facets are oriented straight up or straight down, then you have the most movement. In the thoracic spine, where they're facing back towards us, this is actually going to inhibit flexion and extension, but it will allow quite a lot of rotation. And then in the lumbar spine, where the facets are faced inwards, it's really going to block side flexion and rotation almost completely. And there are actually bony processes on the lumbar vertebrae that really block rotation, but they are going to allow a little bit of flexion and extension. This explains why when we try to do bilateral extension drills for our thoracic spine, we just end up creating movement in the lumbar spine. It's because of the facet joint orientation. The lumbar spine just facilitates that flexion and extension that we're working on. Whereas if we go for a rotational stretch, it's going to be blocked in the lumbar spine and facilitated in the thoracic spine. So even though we're looking for thoracic extension, if we go for rotation, we just end up creating more movement in the rib cage, and movement creates more movement. So once we get the rib cage rotating and moving a lot, then when we do our Olympic lift, when we do our jerk or our handstand, the biological system will naturally sort of self-organize into a position of greater thoracic extension. So we work rotation, but we get a little bit more thoracic extension. Understanding the facet joints made me think of the spine as 3 columns instead of 1. So I kind of started to think of it as a main column of the vertebral bodies, and then 2 smaller supporting columns, a right column of facet joints and a left column of facet joints. When I thought of the spine as a single unit, it made sense to try and use these bilateral extension stretches. But once I started to think of the spine as 3 columns, I realized I needed to stretch the right supporting column and the left supporting column separately in order to kind of create movement in the whole system. Basically, rotating one way to stretch one set of facet joints, and then rotating the opposite direction to stretch the other set. This deeper understanding of the spine led me to focus on these rotational drills as one of the pillars of my overhead mobility training. I really think they were probably a key step in the process of removing the inhibitions I had in the overhead position. So I'll start with a quick snapshot of the 2 most powerful stretches, and then we'll take it right back to basics and up through the progressions so that you can see how to build up to the more intense stretches safely. This is the best place to start with thoracic rotation. It's called the thread needle stretch. So you're in a quadruped position and you're just sliding your hand and arm as far across the floor and then opening your chest to the sky and repeating reps. You can also use this bottom position as a static hold, and then from here you can place one hand on top of the other and kind of open the book to increase thoracic rotation. Once you're comfortable with both of these unloaded stretches, you can move on to doing the stick version. So you thread through in the same way and then place the end of the stick in your bottom palm and slide your hand as far up the stick as you comfortably can. In the start position, make sure your hips are directly above your knees. This is going to block your hip in a flexed position so that the rotation comes from your T-spine rather than from your pelvis. Now I'm going to talk you through these waves of contractions from this different angle. So the setup is the same. End of the stick goes in the bottom palm and the top hand reaches far up the stick. So the first contraction we're going to do is compressing the stick or pushing our hands together, and this is going to last about 10 seconds. Then we're going to allow that contraction to dissipate before stretching the stick or pulling our hands apart for 10 seconds. Again, we'll allow both those contractions to dissipate, and once that happens, we're going to try to slide our top hand further up the stick and kind of open our upper chest to the sky. And then we can repeat the wave of contractions, compressing the stick for 10 seconds, stretching the stick for 10 seconds, and then after letting the contractions dissipate, trying to open further. So the green and blue areas represent the increase in rotation from the first and second waves of contractions. You can do about 3 waves of contractions, and while you're kind of resting and allowing the contractions to dissipate, you can kind of generally try and open your upper chest towards the stick. Once you've done one side, repeat on the other side, so the other arm is on the bottom. This next stretch is very similar. I did come to prefer the stick stretch, which is why I put it first, but this one uses an external load, which can be increased if necessary. Try them both and kind of figure out which one works best for you. So I use a heavier dumbbell on the bottom. I kind of thread my arm through and grab onto the heavy bottom dumbbell. And then the dumbbell on the top is lighter. I think it was like 5 or 7 kilos for me. And I basically imagine my arms are a book, and I open the book as far as I can and allow the top dumbbell to kind of pull the book open. And once I'm in that position where gravity is kind of pulling the book open, I'm going to do this isometric contraction. So the arrows represent the isometric contraction. I'm pushing against the weight of the top dumbbell and also simultaneously trying to lift the bottom dumbbell and my bottom elbow off the ground. So I'm trying to close the book. Then as I release the contraction, I try to open the book, and this increases rotation in the thoracic spine and rib cage. You can repeat the series of contractions about 3 times. So it would be 10 seconds of pushing against the weights or trying to close the book, 10 seconds of allowing the weight to open the book further, and then 10 seconds rest before you start the sequence again. I hope you're excited to try this protocol on yourself or maybe with your students. And yeah, if you do, please let me know how it goes in the comments. And if you have any feedback, that would be awesome. See you in the next video.